Welcome to Opera Central, where artists and administrators come together to talk about the world of the arts. I'm your host, Margaret Siegrist, marketing manager here at Central City Opera. We invite you to settle in for coffee and conversation with us. Text palabras to the number 20123. You'll find great deals on over 400 coffees, roasted to order and shipped to you by the bag from the nation's best roasters. A portion of all purchases go to Central City Opera. Today's installment of Opera Central is a part of a series featuring our original bilingual opera, En Mis Palabras, or In My Own Words, and exploring equity, diversity, and inclusion in the arts. En Mis Palabras was commissioned more than 15 years ago with the intent of acknowledging the 1/5 Latino population here in Colorado. The opera deals with themes of immigration, family, and coming of age, and is performed regularly as part of Central City Opera's year-round education and community engagement programming. Over 19,000 people have seen it since its 2006 premiere. We're talking about En Mis Palabras now because we've recently brought on a new cast, and with that changeover, we've also made some language and dialect improvements to the libretto. So to introduce our guests for today, first we have Anthony or Tony Garcia. He's been Executive Artistic Director of Teatro Cultural and Performing Arts Center since 1989 and has been a member of the company since 1972. Tony's written more than 40 plays. In the words of John Moore, the Denver native inspires and serves his community through his work as an award-winning playwright, musician, composer, educator, social activist, mentor, and nonprofit leader. He has brought conversations about gentrification of neighborhoods, racial inequity, immigration, impacts of war, and even the trials of love to light through Su Teatro's varied programming, end quote. For more than 25 years, Tony has been a faculty member in the Department of Chicano Studies at Metro State College. He's also a board member of the National Association of Latino Art and Culture, and his numerous distinctions include the United States Artist Rockefeller Fellowship and the Denver Post 2010 Theater Person of the Year. And we have Deb Morrow. Deb is Central City Opera's former Director of Education and Community Engagement. For 25 years, she was responsible for creating and implementing entertaining and educational programs for all ages and for making musical impacts on communities throughout the Rocky Mountain region, clocking in at more than 150 events per year. Highlights include Opera Rocks the Rockies, Opera Alive, a summer intensive for high schoolers, and of course, En Mis Palabras, commissioned for middle and high school students. Deb joined the Arvada Chorale as general manager in early 2019. The 43-year-old community chorus serves the western suburbs of Denver. She handles all administrative duties and serves as production manager for all concerts. So before we dig in, Tony, as the original director of En Mis Palabras, will you give our listeners an overview of the opera's plot in just a few words?
Yes, essentially it's a story of a family conflict, a young woman trying to find herself in a multicultural world, and kind of going up against the challenging of traditions and families trying to hold themselves together and the pressures of contemporary society and the pressures to assimilate and be part of the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. So Deb, backing up, how did En Mis Palabras start, the whole project? You said the idea of a truly bilingual opera is something that really inspired you. Tell us more about what that means.
Yeah, I had seen a children's show at a school opera performance that claimed to be bilingual. And when I saw it, it had like 8 Spanish words in it that they talked about, what they meant to the students. So I suppose in some sense it was bilingual, but to me, bilingual really meant incorporating full sentences, full scenes in Spanish, if you were going to call something truly bilingual. And that got me thinking, I had been wanting to do something culturally interesting for about the Latin culture in Colorado. And I decided that I really thought it should be truly bilingual. And So that was the starting point.
Well, tell us a little bit about how you chose the composer and librettist for the project and where the story came from.
I had worked with Roger Ames, who is the composer, several times over the years already at that point. He mentors the Music Words Opera program that we offered to teachers every summer. And so he was our teaching artist for about 10 years before we did En Mis Palabras. I knew his work as a composer. I knew him as an educator. And so he was my logical choice simply because we'd worked together before. I asked him if he was interested. He said, absolutely. And then we got to talking about librettists because that was something I hadn't really thought too much about it yet at that point. And, initially I had thought about trying to locate someone here in Colorado who was bilingual to write the libretto. But Roger suggested a partner that he already worked with, Jeff Gilden. And Jeff, although I wouldn't say he's fully bilingual, he's a decent Spanish speaker and a very conscientious librettist. And he agreed to do the libretto for this piece. We didn't really have a story idea. I had some suggestions. I thought it might be fun to do it about some kind of Colorado history that involved Latin culture. But I sent a bunch of books to Roger and Jeff, about things that had happened historically here in Colorado, and they were not inspired. Meanwhile, they were both teaching together at a high school in New York at the time, doing joint projects together. Jeff is an English teacher, drama teacher, and Roger was the choir teacher there. And they came up with this idea for En Mis Palabras, just as a coming of age story, because they knew high school students. They knew kids this age really well and thought it might be appropriate. And when they sent me when Jeff sent me the story outline, I got really excited then. Up till that point, I'd been thinking, oh yeah, we're gonna do this cute little school program, probably for elementary students. That was my original thought. And suddenly we had this beautiful story idea that might be appropriate for all ages, as it turned out to be. So that's basically the generation and how those two came into the picture.
Absolutely. An original story. Very cool. So the 2006 premiere and workshop of En Mis Palabras was done at Su Teatro, which is where Tony is the executive and artistic director. For any of our listeners who may not know, will you tell us more about Su Teatro, Tony?
Yes. Actually, it was at our old space at Centro in Elyria. And Deb, at some point, we moved the rehearsals over to there. For a reason I don't, but it was Deb's idea, and it was a way of grounding the actors more within the community and bringing our people in to kind of see it and kind of see what was going on there. So it was a great choice, and there were a lot of great choices that Deb made during that time period, including picking me. But what I remember a lot about that process was Deb being very, very supportive of the perspective that I was bringing into the work. Even sometimes when I pushed the actors, because they were not all Latino actors in the original production, and even pushing Micaela, right, who has the same name as my daughter. That's how come I can remember it 15 years later. And her parents actually were pretty well known. They'd written a song called Yo Soy Chicano, which was something that was became an anthem for the Chicano movement, the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement, which is my segue into talking about Su Teatro, because Su Teatro was born out of the Chicano movement in 1972. It was a movement for social justice. It was a movement for cultural identity. It was for a movement for economic equitability, and just a whole list of changes that our community was really wanted to, and in a sense, that really wanted to happen. And in a sense, I would say it parallels the story somewhat, or the issue of assimilation. I think Mexicans and Mexican Americans have this love-hate relationship with the United States. The United States loved the Southwest, so they took it, and we came with it. And I think that's always been the problem. So we like the labor, we just don't want you at the polls with us. We like the labor, we like the food, but we don't want you in the schools with our kids, right? Or we don't want to compete with you for higher paying jobs. Those kind of things are real things, and I think they're subtextual within the conversation of the play. So Su Teatro was created to inform those conversations. We're now located at the house that Henry built. Henry Lowenstein built the Denver Civic Theater. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary. We are now the theater company that has been in the Denver Civic Theater for the longest period of time. We are within the next 2 years, we expect that we will pay it off, and we will be the first company to actually own the Denver Civic Theater free and clear. And
congratulations!
Wow.
Yeah, we have a good community that, I mean, as I found out about the Central City Opera House, is that the community that came and the community that supported it, it was a very different perspective than maybe that I had before that I came out with, and Deb is a big part of that. So we've been producing work. We started performing in the streets, performing anywhere. The schoolhouse that we were in was pretty rough. Not the neighborhood. The neighbors loved it. The kids used to play out in the front. You have kids riding their bikes and using our Wi-Fi there till 10 o'clock at night. And you go, well, this is a poor community. It must be dangerous. It was, well, I don't know. When people were hanging around there, the kids felt pretty comfortable and pretty safe there. So that kind of dynamic and that kind of relationship has been there. We are getting ready to celebrate our 50th anniversary. We're doing a lot of things virtually. We can talk about that a little bit later. The company's toured. We have a show that is scheduled to tour whenever we can tour. We have bookings from LA to New York, and it's called Interview with the Mexican, which is based on the Gustavo Arellano interview. Column. His column that ran in Westward for many years, Ask a Mexican. Some of you may have seen it, so it's a stage production of that. And we were one of like 5 groups that were funded in order to do this national tour. So we have a lot of stuff going on, but it just seems like it's constant anyway.
Sure. Thanks for clarifying. I guess I was thinking of Su Teatro as the company, and then of course you've had multiple venues throughout the time. Yeah. Great. Well,
no, it's kind of interchangeable. The center is the space, and Su Teatro is the company. And we were a company before we had a space. So I guess I don't know. The space, people get confused because they used to say Centro Su Teatro is performing. It's like that building can't do anything. I don't think it's a major thing.
The people are better than the inanimate objects, huh?
That is true. We activate the buildings are there to remind them of we were there.
Yeah. Well, Deb, did you know from the start that you wanted to try to collaborate with Su Teatro for En Mis Palabras?
I don't think so. I'm trying to remember back because, I never wrote all of this down back then, and it's
understood. We appreciate you looking back. Yeah.
So, but anyway, Central City Opera has a history of collaborating with other companies. We've done all kinds of programming with other companies, and so it was kind of a natural thing. I knew I did want somebody from the Latin culture to direct it because, we were kind of walking a fine edge. We had 2 white composers. My company, had very few people of Latin culture to rely on. And so that was the main impetus. I had no idea if Tony would be interested because we had never met, I don't think, at that point. If we had, it had been, at some SCFD event, and we didn't know each other in any case. So, but I called him, this is how I remember it. Tony, you tell me if I'm wrong. I just called you up one day and said, I'd like to talk to you about a project I'm doing. And as my recollection is, you weren't necessarily very interested at first. I mean, I don't know whether it was the opera aspect or what, but you said, when I told you a little bit about it, you said you'd think about it, but you wanted to see the script first before you committed, of course. And when I sent it to you, so as I said, this is how I'm remembering it. You tell me if I'm wrong, but I sent you the script and you called me back and said, yeah, I'll do it. I like it. That's what I remember.
We can go with that, Dory.
Okay.
I'm fine with that.
Here, close it.
What, you know, I had done, and I'm trying to remember the sequence. I directed a piece called And Now Miguel for the Arvada Center.
Well,
And I don't remember if that was before or after this. And I have had, at that time, if you remember, nobody was trying to do our stuff. Actually, you know, there were people, we were the only ones doing stuff, and people, you know, we got called, I got scripts from people which were, you know, we want to do this piece, we want to feature Latinos in it, and they would have a Latino maid in it, and it would really be about, you know, people pulling down the culture. I was getting stuff like that all the time, and was not very, very interested in doing that. And actually, it would bother me, you know. But the key issue was how much I was going to be able to say, hey, there's a level of authenticity involved in this, and Deb and Roger were very, very supportive of this. You know, pronunciation of certain words, kind of, you know, even tweaking some of the dialogue at times and such, even pushing the actors the way I remember that specifically, because they had a tendency, because they got to sing, so they got to stand in one place and they got to do this stuff, and it was like, yeah, but there's a physical action taking place here too, and that was a little bit tough for them. I think they appreciated it, but it was Deb who said this is the way it's going to go, and so then that meant they were going to have to figure out how to make that happen, and we did. She would say, I think they've had a good acting lesson today, and
yes.
And he was in high school, right?
I'm sorry?
Mika was in high school at the time, wasn't she?
Yeah. We worked her pretty hard, and she grew, and she became more confident, and she more accomplished at that, and it was and she understood there was a lot of pressure on her, and knowing her grandparents as I did, that made a big difference too. Because she knew that at some point the circle was going to have to come back to them talking to me and then going back. So, and that was just a coincidence. None of us knew that relationship existed. They're kind of iconic in our community for what they did, and so that was a big factor too. But also, you know, allowing and the actors willing to make the changes and to adjust. And Roger was I thought Roger was great. He's a funny guy. He rolls with the punches a lot. He has a lot of passion for stuff, and doesn't take, this is my work is golden, nobody can touch it kind of stuff. He really wanted it to be authentic and that made a big difference. That made a big difference in the production, and then we were under we're always under a tight deadline. I'm sure we were. Yes, we were. I'm sure we were. And the issue, I'm sorry, I'll stop and if you want me to, but let me just offer this. No, the issue of assimilation and traditional family conflict is ongoing. We're still having those conversations now. I mean, if you look at the story of the film La Bamba is a story about Latinos trying to assimilate into the mainstream. Richie Valens doesn't speak Spanish, but what he did is he gave us access to Spanish through the song La Bamba, which doesn't sound anything. Well, it does. It kind of sounds similar to the original song, which comes from Veracruz, which actually comes from Africa. It's an African rhythm. So all that piece of us mixing the different cultural trains and influences is really part and parcel of the Chicano culture, because we are a group of mixed race people. We come from multiple cultures and multiple races, multiple ethnicities, and multiple experiences. We have a huge experience here in the United States and have influenced so many things in the United States. I say La Bamba, everybody knows. I had somebody once ask me, how do you say sing La Bamba? How do you say La Bamba? How do you sing La Bamba in Spanish? And it was like, La Bamba is in Spanish. He was like, because they had always heard it as a song that they knew was in English. I mean, it was a song that was part of their piece. It's like, well, you know what? It's twist and shout, you know? You know, it's good loving. It's every song. I always tell when I'm teaching anybody guitar, it's like, you know what, you only need to know like 3 chords or whatever, but like every song is La Bamba in the end, at some point.
Oh my gosh. Well, so you were talking a lot about receiving a lot of different work at that time, people asking you to work on projects with them. Were you looking as the artistic director at Su Teatro to make sure that it aligned with the mission at the company?
Yeah, I always thought that I was going to have to answer for it, that I was going to have to stand behind my work. I don't think Deb would do anything that she couldn't feel was she could stand behind it, and that was the same with us. You know, when we did En Miguel, they let me chop that up quite a bit. I probably shouldn't say this, but Kathy was great. I did far less in terms of that with En Mis Palabras. So so I don't remember which came first, but it was significantly. It was in a significantly better position to be able to do that. But once I would come into, we went to Arvada Center, there were 500 people there, and I was the guy. People from my community were coming in saying, you know, I would hear it. That's one of the great things about our community, and I'm sure you find this too. If they don't like it, they have no problem walking up to you and going, I didn't like that. You know, not a problem at all. And I also, you have to consider the audience. I mean, there's a great piece in there about this is my struggle. Whether your struggle with as a teenager, God, teenagers are so messed up. I feel so sorry for them, you know. I don't know how any of us survived it, you know. And they talk about boys in particular, you know, that something kind of goes crazy, like when they hit 14 and doesn't resolve itself to they're like 25. I'm not making this up. And it's not just based on the kids. There is something like that. And they are being hit with so many things. And now let's take on the other piece, because I just got off a conversation about this, about what's happening with them during COVID. You know, the incidences of physical abuse have grown in communities, right? That all that stress of poverty of parents who are working these essential jobs, of having to go to these places where they could get sick, also losing those jobs, all that stuff's just piling up on them. And so all of this stuff is represented in this. And in a lot of ways, the parents don't get it, you know, because they're just trying to survive here. In my life, my family grew up poor. My mother grew up during the Depression. We grew up living on welfare. And for you to go get a job and bring money into the family was a priority. So when I said, I want to go to college, I want to be a writer, my mom was like, I want you to be somebody else's son. She didn't say that, but she didn't get it. When I graduated from college, she came to the ceremony and she said, you know, if I'd have known this would have been such a big deal, I would have probably made dinner or something, right? But it was a contrast between surviving the day-to-day and having that long-term vision. The character wants to have this life here. She sees all her friends having access to that life. And her parents say, we can barely make it to the next paycheck. And you're thinking about what you're going to do 20 years from now. You got to think of what you're going to do next month.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, you know, looking back on, 15 years ago, workshopping and premiering the opera, do you feel like the same themes really jump out at you now as did then? Or do you feel like it's sort of changed for you over the time
For me, you know, that whole coming of age, as Tony just far more eloquently than I could described it, that, you know, that is universal for everyone. We've all gone through it. Our kids are going through it, or have been through it in my case, because my kids are old. You know, everybody can relate to this story on pretty much any level. And that's why I loved what Jeff sent me when he sent me the story outline. You know, my mind just immediately said, yeah, this, you know, if this is well written and well composed, this is going to be a really good piece. And I think the time has shown that it is. You know, there certainly can be flaws, are probably flaws in it still today, you know, in the language or anything else. But overall, it works. It's a really good piece that works. And I don't think that's changed since since it came along. It changes subtly depending on who's cast. I mean, every cast has a different take on their characters, slightly, but it never fails to move me. I've seen every production, every performance we've ever done of it, and it never fails to move me. And I'm usually backstage, packing stuff up while they're finishing the show out front. It still gets me every time. So
I have to say, I'm not a crier. I've seen it a couple times live, and then I was listening to it for research, just kind of like writing things down, like, oh, that's very interesting. And then, it was that ensemble at the end, the sort of reconciliation bit, and I was like, oh my God.
I know, it really lifts you up, doesn't it?
Absolutely. But speaking more about casting, it was decided really early on, actually still when the opera was being written, I think, that Central City Opera would only cast artists with Latinx background in that leading role of Ana Maria. Deb, tell us more about that decision, and also how that fits in with your experience of opera casting in general.
Well, yeah, opera casting, like any other theater company, I think is, there's always pitfalls and problems and issues to be dealt with. And certainly, historically, characters have not been cast appropriately, culturally appropriately, in operas throughout time. On the other hand, opera was one of the first art forms in this country, at least, to cast people of color in roles that were traditionally played by white people. So, it all goes a lot of different ways. But as far as, I'm not sure whether it was before I talked with Tony or after I talked with Tony, that choice was made. But I felt pretty strongly that it was important that at least that character should be culturally appropriate. And I would hope that we could find others for the other roles, but that didn't seem quite as important to me, because the more important thing, as Tony knows, when you have a certain pool to cast from, that has the scheduling availability, we'll take the amount of pay that you're going to pay, amount of money that you're going to pay them, all sorts of issues. And in our case, we were talking about being available during the day to do school programs, which is, there's not a lot of people that have that availability in the performing world, because they all have other jobs. But in this case, I'm not sure how we discussed that, Tony. I really am not, about those other characters, but Ana Maria was always meant to be cast appropriately, and has been.
It was cast before it was already cast by the time I came in.
That's true. That's true.
I think, as I understand, I chatted with Emily about it, the current director of education. She had said it's sort of an unwritten but very enforced rule that, it's going to be an Ana Maria with Latinx background, and then the goal is the most diverse cast otherwise, but Ana Maria is sort of the core of that. So following that up, I would love to hear both of your thoughts just more broadly on the value of representation in the arts, what it means to you, and you both have lots of experience as leaders with performing arts organizations. What does it mean to audience members as well? Can I start with you, Tony?
Well, I'd like to actually go backwards to the other question, if you don't mind. I think everybody kind of realized that we were treading some ground that we hadn't in the relationship between the two organizations, in the reception. I mean, opera, especially that style too, it's a little bit more formal. It's significantly more formal than the kind of work that we do. We do a lot of ensemble singing to cover up all the weaknesses that we might have, and we focus on solo. We all do that. We all, it's like, okay, you're too tall. Why don't you just sit down during all your scenes? And I think the actors understood that too. I remember watching their growth, watching that we had to have some open conversations, some conversations that were that were like, that's a little bit different than the way we do it, and people having to hear that they had to change something, right? I also remember that, just going back to the content of the piece, is that how important the grandmother's role is, because that's such an important part of our community, the matriarchal, because a lot of people think the Mexican Latino community is this concept of machismo, right? I don't know any of these passive Latinas that people are talking about. They are not in my family. They are not in the people that I work with, the women that I work with. They're not the women that I engage with. So whoever my husband makes all the decisions for me, I don't know where the hell they are, right? I will say also, that was not my mother. That was not my grandmother, so she has that. Here's how I still raise my son, who's a grown man, and here's how I teach him to raise my granddaughter. Those are important subtextual conversations in our community, right? So for me, it goes beyond just this question of what people look like. So you could audition for Su Teatro for any role that you could play, even a male role, if that was the case, because we were talking about imperfection and mistakes and such. So there's this whole concept called Yohen in Japanese pottery making. I directed this play called Yohen, and it's about searching for the imperfection that people keep, right? We're going to perform a piece called Chorizo and My Guayabera, right? And it's based on a true story about me being too impatient to wait till I stopped driving my car to eat a taco chorizo, and I spilled a white stain on the middle of my guayabera, which everybody has done something like that, and then stood in front of an audience and didn't realize I had this giant red stain going down the front of my shirt, and asking the audience, did you notice this? They go, oh yeah, but I got one here too, right? So that idea of imperfection, that idea of we don't have it right, but that's what we're striving for. That's the thing that changes from show to show, from cast to cast. And that's really where the art exists. So when we transitioning to your actual question is that, Latinos come in all colors. We're black, we're white. A lot of them look like me. I think I'm fortunate that I never had to pass for anything other than I was, and I didn't have that confusion. There's a guy named Jose Antonio Burciaga who says that Mexican Americans, the Chicanos, live in the hyphen between Mexican and American. So we're always in transition. So I think it's important to look for those pieces that are within that authentic. To just think that I can do, you can't fake the singing, right? But you can also say, this is the way the singing goes, if that's authentic and that's real. It's like, it may not hit that note the way that you want it to be in this box, because there's no definitive box, especially when it comes to people's identity. So I'm not arguing that we're not out there. I think the thing is really been the push in the other side has been, we haven't had access to those other spaces. When we get invited to, I think I may have said this on some other interview. I don't know. This is my latest rant. It's been around for a while. We get invited to work in the schools and in the universities. We never get invited in by the theater departments. We get invited in by the ethnic studies departments, by the diversity departments, because we don't represent that perception, that box of what, apparently we don't know anything about theater. We only know about community engagement, and so to me, that's where the conflict lies. You know what I mean? That we can, and then the other piece of it is that we are then forced to compete for those same positions with people who have had more opportunity, more experience in those spaces, right? And this is an open call to anybody who wants to audition at Su Teatro. We had this great piece we did when we had these guys they're supposed to be twins, and one was an African American and one was a Chicano, and we left it there. It was not like we were hiding it. It was like, it's really, people go, yeah, they're twins. And people would go, they don't look anything, they didn't even know how to respond to it. It was great because I loved having them so confused out there, you know, and just the joke that we were in the womb together, wasn't that great? And having these conversations. And so that's, I don't know, that's probably more of a jumbled answer than the clear cut stuff. It really is flipping. There's a lot of, somebody offered me a term. He says there's people who are working on DEI and there are people who are living it. And that's where my intersection is right now, how to bring those two groups together or how to understand that place.
Deb, do you have anything to add to that? Representation?
We had a couple of times we actually performed En Mis Palabras for elementary audiences because the principals at a couple of schools that were primarily Latin kids, Latin culture kids, you know, a high percentage. They wanted that piece rather than some of the other pieces that we offered. And, you know, I explained to them that it was perhaps a little more mature content than they might want for their elementary kids. But I also said, you know, third grade and above is probably fine with this piece. I mean, as far as the content went. And when we did do those performances at those schools, those kids were so responsive to the Spanish. They just loved that so much of the piece was in Spanish. And it's not, you know, I mean, it really is only about 40% of the piece. It's not even half and half, but it's enough. It was enough that they really related to that. And we've had the same response on individuals in middle school performances. We found over time that this actually plays better in middle school than it did in high school. And I think the reason for that is that high school kids are a little too cool to admit that they've just been through this or still going through this kind of a situation. And middle school kids are just starting it, just getting into it, and they really relate. So we found, we actually turned our focus to middle school with this program. And family audiences. Family audiences love this program because as I said before, all generations relate to this in every way. The parents relate to the parents as parents, but they also relate to the kids because they went through it too. You know, it kind of takes you back and you remember, oh my gosh, yeah, it was a horrible time. So that's been, you know, we've had response based on the Spanish, but also just general response to the storyline as well.
Yeah.
Can I offer just an understanding of also the time period? Colorado is an official English state, right? Which you're coming very shortly after the English only movement, which was a movement to crush bilingual education. Students, I have a student, she's 18, 19 years old. She told a story about being hit with a ruler in her hands for speaking Spanish. So those kind of memories are part of our communities. We know that. So when we go up and we see something and Spanish is being spoken, there's an affirmation about who I am because our community was punished and maybe not always physically, but in other ways in terms of access. You don't talk to people in public because you have an accent. Don't use those words. It wasn't too long ago, there was a guy in New York, remember when he was yelling at a lawyer who was yelling at the students in a restaurant and the workers in a restaurant for speaking Spanish and telling them to go back to Mexico. And then they did, I don't know if you guys know about this, and they did protests outside of his place where mariachis came and sang outside of his apartment. So, you know, here we have it, music in Spanish, and now it's a political statement, right? So when we do this thing and it's in mis palabras, it says, yes, we can use both those languages and we can have access to them. It's a very empowering thing for those kids, especially middle school, as you're saying about middle schoolers, because if they come here and they're Spanish dominant, their chances of speaking English really diminish because it's harder to learn a foreign language as you get older. For those who have studied a foreign language, when they're kids, when they come here and they're 4, 5, 6, they go back and forth between Spanish and English like it's nothing. By the time they get to middle school, they're much more self-conscious about what they say and they tend to get into their cliques. And by the time they get into, and they're gone by high school. And there were, so that, I mean, I guess I'm just offering some of the context underneath that stuff of why that reaction is so powerful. It's a reinforcement. It's an affirmation of my language is who I am. And being told who you are is not good enough. Now we're being told who I am is sufficient.
You mentioned music being really important in society and in communication. I'm curious, so I've read that a lot of your plays have a lot of music involved, and I know that you compose as well. Was it different to approach an opera?
I think that's why we wanted to, that's one of the reasons we wanted to do it. I wanted to get in a better understanding of the process. And a lot, you know, a lot more music. We do a lot more things with music since that time. So I would say that there was the influence that I received from doing that. You know, I was familiar with zarzuelas. You know, the father of our movement, Luis Valdez, Luis changed the theater dramatically, the canon of the theater. He had a line in a play that said, Simón que yes. Now, if you know Spanish and you know English, those words are probably not really accurate in either place, right? Simón is slang, which means yes, man. But que yes, you go from Spanish to English and stuff. And just in saying that, he opened up a whole new dialogue for us, right? And he started using what we call a corrido. And corridos are storytelling methods with, you know, that we first started doing our plays. This piece then was an interesting way for us to start to tell storytelling in a different way. And I wanted to see how we could overlap that piece. So we were interested in that. I loved that everybody could sing so well. That was like, you know, we weren't spending a lot of time trying to, you know, I sing well enough to point at a note sometimes. You know, I know where the note should be, but I can't get there. I'll point to it and you go find it. And I think that there was me having been able to produce these things in much more intimate settings and a much more, less, well, I don't want to say structured, but a much more informal environment. I think that was an element that I was able to bring to the piece because I understood that and it crossed over for us to be able to say, okay, you walk off now, you come on and do this thing and it's all going to come. It'll be fluid, don't worry, because again, we're not making a mistake. This is the way we want it to be. I really wanted my room to be yellow, right? Even though I was mixing probably some other color. That's, you know, but that's what you do in the art world, right? You said, yeah, I really did want those colors. I want to see what happened when we did it that way. So yeah, opera I was like, okay, this is different. I think this is something that we can learn from, but we can push some boundaries. And that was the stimulation and the idea that they were willing to come into our barrio, into our community, and do that work and be available. Because I have open rehearsals. I just don't want you talking and make a bunch of noise. But I mean, if the actors can't hang with people in there while we're working and trying to do stuff, then they're not going to be able to hang with an audience. So, and I don't put my actors in a place. I mean, if we're doing a nude scene, nobody's going to be in there. We understand that kind of piece. But in general, these people were there. They were open, had fine with people coming in, checking it out, moving out, and that gave it all that piece, that combination of the two communities and the openness that Deb brought with the group to interact with our community really made a huge difference in what the production was and the experience that I had.
Yeah.
And to our people too, absolutely.
Well, digging a little more into the production piece, just for our listeners, En Mis Palabras is a portable show. It has drops and set pieces that we take with us to wherever we're performing it, often schools, community spaces, sometimes theaters. I know you were both very much involved in that set design and sort of visual production. Can I start with you, Deb? Tell us a little bit more about that.
I hired Michael Gorian to create the sets. He actually took them to a set painter because he wasn't a painter himself, but you helped him design those drops. We have 3 drops representing Ana Maria's bedroom. The middle one kind of represents the kitchen area of the house, and the third one represents basically the funeral home or abuela's personality. But that was all your concept, as I recall. Those three drops, And then you and Michael talked about the symbolism, symbols to use on them, pictures to use. And I think they came out beautifully. I mean, and they've now been around for 16 years and still going strong, still looking good. And it's probably the most complicated, well, it is definitely the most complicated school show that we did while I was there. For setup and haul, it has a pretty good size set to haul and set up in a short amount of time, but it works. And you also consulted about the costumes, as I recall, for the actors, so the singers.
Do you have more to share on the symbolism, Tony?
Yeah, we come, talking about Luis Valdez, he worked with a group called Teatro Campesino, who worked in support of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Great Strike, and they used to go and perform on the back of flatbed trucks, and they would perform. We grew up performing in the streets and in parks. It took us, in '89, we moved into our facility, but that was 17 years that we didn't have a space. We did our first performance at the Changing Scene, Deb. I know you might remember that. The Slightly Off Center Theater, even before that. And that was in '82. So it was after 10 years that we did our first really on stage kind of thing. So this kind of we called guerrilla theater at the time. This kind of approach was something that we were fairly familiar with. But I also, working with the artist and Michael, that we talked about the subtextual conversations, the psychological conversations that were taking place, and those symbols that exist in there. I know we talked about corn. I remember there was an image of and we talked about having the goatee, right? I remember some pieces.
Sunglasses and goatee, yes.
Yeah, and we thought, and it was those ways of telling, as Deb really well articulated, the subtextual conversation and emotional environment of the different spaces, and trying to set it up quickly and it being fluid in the movement and such. And yeah, I do remember those conversations and keeping it tight. There was this thing of having everything in a really tight space too, because I wanted to talk, to kind of get this, let people know the idea, environment of. I was walking down the street the other day, and there's just so many apartment complexes going up in Denver. Denver just going straight up, and it has been, I don't know, almost 50 years since I lived in an apartment. And you think about when you live in that apartment, how tiny that house is, and that's that claustrophobic piece. Where's the lack of privacy that the teenagers want? So we wanted to create that enclosed piece of everybody's floating in and out of each other's lives, because it's an intimacy, but it's not always a pleasant intimacy that poverty brings.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Wow, yeah. Well, we're just about out of time here, but I would love to leave our listeners with one little thing here. In just a few words, will each of you tell us what En mis palabras means to you? Just sum it up. Deb?
Well, I admit that this is probably the piece I'm the most proud of fostering, starting the process to create of anything that I did at Central City in all those years. And I look back now and I think, I don't know how I had the energy to do as much as we did. I mean, we created lots and lots of programs, but this one to me felt the most fulfilling. I guess that would be the right word. It just, because it's such a beautiful piece, because everyone is so committed to it who performs in it, because Tony was so committed to it, because Michael was committed to it in the set design, Roger and Jeff were both committed in their creation of it. I just think it's, it makes my heart warm that I was kind of the instigator of that whole process. And so that's how I feel about it.
Tony?
I feel a lot of respect for Deb and her vision. And when I think about it, and I think about the journey she's taken the piece on, I feel, I feel overwhelmed by it. I feel really impressed by her commitment to that work. I do remember, I mean, I can still hum, I can still sing "En mis palabras," right? And I remember Roger going, "Yeah, I like a nice hook every now and then," right? And just, and I just, it really challenged the formality of what I perceived as opera. And it also, I think in many ways, it freed us up to say, as I keep talking about, yeah, we're looking for the imperfections in there, and allowed me, I mean, I've had a long collaboration with Daniel Valdez, who's a composer, and, and I learned a lot about writing music in it, but I got a lot braver with my own music after this experience. I never envisioned myself as that. I like to write songs just because I like to. I mean, I have a song called Chorizo Maguayabera. We got one called White People Walking Their Dogs, which is about gentrification. And so that's where I thought I was going to live. And it turns out that this gave me the strength to, or the confidence to move into other areas and stuff like that. And like I said, the biggest thing I take away is my respect for Deb and the work that she did in this project.
Ditto.
Well, thank you both so much for being with us today. We really appreciate the conversation and for all the time you took to share your stories. To everyone who tuned in, thanks for listening. More episodes are available of Opera Central, and you can learn more about our programs at centralcityopera.org. Thanks for being with us today.
Bye-bye.
Adios.
Adios. Thank you, Deb. I love you.
We do.
In my own words, and miss